welcome to the 49th edition of Lifestory, brought to you by the Living Memory Association, based out of the Wee Museum of Memory in Leith, Edinburgh. In this episode, we are joined by Melvin Farquharson, who at the age of 86 takes us through the ups and downs of his life. From tales of his childhood spent playing in his backyard to his time spent studying engineering at Heriot-Watt University, later his 2 years of national service, and eventually on to his further education and career in law, first with his father's firm, and later on with British Gas. Back in time we go.
Mel, welcome to Life Story. Thanks for coming in. Firstly, if you don't mind revealing your age, can you tell me how old you are and where you were born?
86, and I was born in Edinburgh, Silverhouse.
And can you tell me a little bit about your parents, please, Mel?
My parents were born in Dunfermline. My mother was Bertha, and she was a children's nurse. Came to work in it. My father was born in Dunfermline. He was training as what they called a law clerk in these days. Nowadays they call them solicitors. He came to Edinburgh, having met my mother, and they'd got married and bought a house in Davison's Mains in Silverhouse, which was a new build at that time. And I appeared a few months later in September 1937.
Can you remember how they met?
They were born and brought up in Edinburgh, in Dunfermline, which is a relatively small place in these days. And I suspect they probably met just as youngsters meet. I don't know for sure. My mother went to local school here, and my father went to, I think he went to Dunfermline High, so they probably didn't meet at school. But they might have, or through the Scouts or something like that.
And to go even further back, Mel, did you have any contact with your grandparents growing up?
Oh no, that was long before my time.
No, not their grandparents, your grandparents.
Oh, my grandparents. You know, I actually have to think for a minute about who you're talking about. So that's my mother and father's parents.
Yes, that's
that
right.
we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes, my maternal grandparents. They came from Loch. My mother's parents came from Lochgelly, and he was a plumber, and he worked for what they called the Admiralty, which is the Admiralty, but it was a Fife pronunciation, was Admiralty. He had been in the First World War as a soldier and survived. My father's father, he came from Dunfermline. He was a publican, and then the naughty man ran off with another lassie.
Oh dear.
So that was the family scandal.
Do you have any memories of the pub? Were you ever in and around the pub or waiting on your dad or anything outside?
I've got no recollections of that at all. I can't remember where the pub was. It was through in the west. Oddly enough, his son, I discovered by pure accident, was the manager of a pub at the bottom of Dundas Street.
And did you have any brothers and sisters, Mel?
I had two sisters, Joan and Morag. Joan, the elder of the two, she appeared when I was about 3, followed by Morag a few years later. I was brought up during the war as the big brother, helping Mummy to look after the babies. So I learnt about how to change nappies and silly things like that. But that was great fun.
Your dad was away fighting in the war, or what was his role?
My dad was called up very early stage of the war. He'd been in the Territorial Army, the TA, which was a standard thing at that time, and then they had the mass call-ups in the early 40s. And he was called up, went into the army for a year, and then was transferred to the RAF. He was commissioned. He wasn't air crew at all, he was ground crew. He never ever spoke about it. I know he went into a thing called Second Tactical Air in intelligence. Make what you like of what intelligence means. He never ever spoke about it. And if you asked him, he just clammed up. But he ended as a squadron leader, so that's the equivalent of major or lieutenant colonel. So he was relatively senior amongst a mass of others. So there's no saying what he was doing.
Because people who served in the war, your dad could have been doing intelligence work, could have been doing top secret spy type work, or he could just be the kind of man who didn't want to talk about the war. There's a lot of those kind of guys as well.
I think there was a bit of that. And I always wondered, as a smaller boy, because we were fascinated with the war, it was all exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Was he doing something wrong? Was he torturing prisoners to get in some information? Or was he one of these brave guys that was parachuted into whatever?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
We'll never know.
You never know.
And can you picture in your mind the house that you grew up in? Is there much of it that sticks in your mind? Can you think of what colour the front door was or what kind of house you grew up in?
Yep, it's 45 Silverhouse Drive. That's Davison's Mains. I don't know if you know that area.
Yep.
That's the new build. Just before the war, it was McTaggart Mickerell builders. And it's the drive. Do you know Davison's Mains?
My first life experience at Davidson's Mains was I played for Towerbank Primary School football team, and up to that point we'd never lost any games, and we went up to Davidson's Mains and played them and lost 4-0. and it was my first ever experience of defeat.
The humiliation of it.
Yes, so that's my only connection with Davison's Mains.
There used to be a train station at Barnton, by the Barnton Hotel, and then of course you had the Cali station, which no longer exists, but the Cali Hotel still exists. That's the junction of William Road and Princess Street at the West End. And the common method of transport was the local train service, and one ran from Barnton through Davison's Mains, Blackhall, Craigleith and what have you, into the Cali station. So I remember that very clearly, and we used to stand at the back window being held by your mummy, waving to your daddy.
And where did you hang about when you were playing with your pals, or what are your memories of playing? Were you playing in the street? Was
Oh yes,
and
you could play in the street because there's no cars. There was the Keenan's, the milkman, the Co-op, this sort of thing. But only those and the likes of those had cars. And even if they had a car, you hadn't petrol, unless you were the local doctor, which is different. But yes, I mean, I remember regularly after you'd finished your breakfast, right, away you go and come back at dinner time. And of course it was always dinner time these days, not lunch. Never heard of the word lunch. And we'd be sent out to the play, and we would play on the not the railway line, but the railway embankment. But then the train only ran once every half an hour, and the driver knew perfectly well that all the kids were clambering around. I remember it very, very clearly. It was great fun.
And I take it you could hear the train coming in those days. It wouldn't be going fast enough to...
And you see, the train ran along the embankment, was at the bottom of our garden, and that's the bottom of Sylvanus Drive. So the train drivers all knew the kids were out playing, climbing the fir trees and things like that. So when they were coming along, they would be tooting away like mad. And of course, your mother would be out saying, "Come on, that's the train coming, down you come." And it was great. I mean, it really was good fun. And we were all about the same age.
What were your earliest friendships? Can you remember any names from those days?
Oh, yes. I'm choking up. Because the last one died about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
I'm not a crybaby, but God, I choke up.
It's a long time to be friends.
Yeah. We were next door neighbours, and his dad was my surrogate dad when my dad was in the forces, because his dad wasn't. So I remember being carried out into the air raid shelter once when we had one of the raids. Edinburgh wasn't bad for raids, but of course Forsyth and Clydebank got them. But yeah, there was Colin who stayed next door, and his sister, and I had all my pals. We all went to Stewart's, but we went to the same nursery school, same Cubs and Scouts, same schools, mainly Stewart's, Heriot's, and there was another school that was within sensible travelling distance. A lot of schools were far too far outside Edinburgh to send your 5-year-old son off.
And can you remember any birthday parties from those days?
Yes, we used to have the birthday parties, and it was usually the social grouping, of course, matters. You know, you've all got your own social groups, and where I was, they had parties in a local hotel, and it was all your pals from school, or maybe your next door neighbours, because Edinburgh was a very socially divided city, and still is. You differ between, say, Drylaw and Blackhall. It's huge. Still is. I mean, I stay in Trinity, and you just go along the road and you're into the fairly rough areas, so you get huge gaps. And yes, we had parties. We used to go to a local hotel and usually laid on a conjurer, and you played all sorts of daft party games and things. The ones I remember was when we would be, let's say, the sort of 5 to 10 age group, getting a bit sophisticated when you're 12.
Are there any presents that stuck in your mind that you were given?
Actual presents in the sense of the sort of thing you would get for your birthday from your pals. Not really.
Well, no, from your mum and dad even.
But from mum and Christmas, first Meccano set, that was wow. And that's what got my interest in engine. And it was all by electrical set, and then a crystal set and things like that.
And that was you on the path.
Yeah, and then I got my little carpentry set and things like that. And I've never seen it. But a toy that boys used to get, and some girls, but it was a boys thing really. You got little sort of clay bricks and packets of, not cement, but it was effectively a cement. So you were a bricklayer, but very small. And I used to love that sort of thing.
And were you part of any youth organisations with your pals? Did you go to the BBs and Scouts? Is that kind of thing going on?
Yes. The first thing I remember was going to Sunday school. That was just in the local church in D Mains. And then I joined the Cubs, My parents were very keen on that. My father had been a King Scout back when he was a youngster. So I went to the Cubs, and that was the Craman Cubs. Up through the Cubs, into the Scouts, that's Craman Scouts. I sort of, when I was a mid-teenager, entering the puberty stage, I had all sorts of kind of hang-ups, because the boys had muscles, and I was a skinny loona. There's the name Charlie Atlas,
yes.
Bodybuilding ring.
Yeah.
Do you remember the Charlie Atlas side word? Dynamic tension.
Yeah, they used to be in my Spider-Man comics at the back, so I remember
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these came out, and I was the first half of a Charlie Atlas advert, all skin and bone and things. I was very, very conscious of that, because the rest of the boys were, quite well built. So I began to drop out of things like Scouts and things like that at school as well, much to my parents' annoyance. I remember the Scoutmaster coming to see them, saying, "Melvin's not coming to Scouts anymore, what's wrong?" So Dad, as a former King Scout, was not at all happy about that. But anyway.
And were your mates at Stuart's Mill, were they starting to play rugby then?
Yes, and I didn't like rugby at all, and I still think it's a stupid game. Anything that involves bashing your head, either with a ball or somebody's boxing glove, is just a stupid thing to do. And when you see the number of serious brain injuries that are coming to the fore now, you realise. But of course now, I don't think you're allowed to do the sort of thing that we used to do playing sports. And certainly in rugby, they've cut back scrums, tackling, and certainly there's age limits. You cannot do that if you're below, I think it's something like 8 or maybe.
It's the same with football.
And rightly so.
Yeah, you can't head the ball at football till you're 12, I don't think, these days.
Well, if you think of a wet football that you head, what do you think that does to your brain? Which is just a little piece of jelly.
Did you have much in the way of memories of your primary school days? You were at Stuart's Melville primary and secondary, were you?
What school?
Were you at Stew Mill? Were you a Stew Mill boy?
Daniel Stewart's, if you don't mind.
So as it was then, Daniel Stewart's.
That's right. Daniel Stewart's.
When did it become Daniel Stewart's and Melville College then? Or was that the 70s
When I
or
was
80s
about 18, it was still Daniel Stewart's, and I was fifth year, or maybe it was the year after I left school, and we heard that there was a suggestion that it should take in Melville College, which used to be in Melville Street, hence the name, and we didn't approve of that. It's a soppy school. Well, oddly enough, despite what I was saying about rugby, they can't play rugby. They're darn no good, because the schools were very competitive and still are. So it was Daniel Stewart's in these days, and I remember going in at that time. I think you started school at 5. There's a gang of us from Sullivan House, because we were all in age, our parents all knew everybody. So we all went to a nursery school, which was actually at the back of Daniel Stewart's, and played with coloured bricks. And then you went to the school, and I think you went at 5. You started school. And I remember the first year, and your mummy took you to the school, and you were left in the classroom. The teacher came in, and she was Miss Stewart, who was a lovely Canadian girl. And some of the boys were crying, because their mummy had left them behind. I didn't give a damn. Because this was exciting. What's going to happen now? And of course, we were all from the same street. Well, not all, but there's about 5 of us on the same street, including Colin, who stayed next door, and one or two others. Again, as I say, all within a matter of a year or two age-wise. And so we started in the first year with Miss Stewart and learnt to abacus and all that sort of stuff. And they had these funny boards for teaching you numbers and letting. That was great fun. So I went up through the junior school in Stewart's. Oddly enough, next door to Stewart's there's a big house, and that's Dean Park House. And that's why when you went to get your interview for National Service, you went for your interview. Anyway, that's by the by. So I was in the junior school, and right up to, what was effectively the quali class, and you stepped up, and then eventually going into the senior school. And of course, it was grading all the way, and there's a lot of competition amongst us. Funny enough, I was thinking about this, particularly when I heard that Colin had died, and it took me back there's a bunch, about half a dozen boys in Sullivan House, all living literally in the same street, and thinking about what they ended up doing.
So did those friendships go right through secondary school as well?
Yes.
Were they at junior
and they
school
continued into adulthood. I mean, right up until they started popping off, we exchanged Christmas cards. And my sisters still exchange Christmas cards with Colin's sister.
Yeah, that's nice.
And of course, there's a lot of histories. I mean, my sisters are now in their early 50s.
And were you a well-behaved boy at school?
Oh, yes. My mother had been a nanny. I knew how to bring up children and let it be known when she's not happy. She was a loving, caring mother, but she expected you to be well-behaved. Please and thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Johnson, and this sort of thing. And of course, because everybody knew everybody, any more cheek from you, and I'll speak to your mother. And of course, there were some of the men. Mothers were essentially quite loving, caring creatures. Mm-hmm. Some of the men were a bit different. Some of them were just fierce. And you thought, oh, it's Mr. Johnson. I'll go to the other side of the road and walk down the other pavement, you know. And it was always, you know, hello, Mr. Johnson, or hello, Mrs. Johnson, or what have you. We were polite kids. But if you went round into the village, of course, then you had the other boys who were not so polite, and you had to steer clear of them because I'll bash you if you're not a good But then you get that in any community.
So did you never get the belt at school then?
You want to see the streaks? Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We had, Stuarts did not go in for physical punishment to any extent, except you always had the odd teacher who was different. We had the old-fashioned taws, the Lochgelly taws. Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, we've got one out there.
Aye.
In the wee museum.
It stings. I don't think I got it until about class 5, so I'd be approaching 10. The other teachers, like Miss Stewart, Miss Burt and Miss Waters, they gave you a row. Go and stand there. You're a bad boy, and you'll stay there until I tell you to come back. And there was certainly no slapping or hitting. And then I think the first one was, her surname's suddenly gone, came from Queensferry, and she was very partial. She had the drawer in her desk, and I've seen the desks out there. She'd pull that out come with the taws. And you had to hold your hand out and pull your sleeve down, because if they missed it, we had one or two boys got their wrists slit, very seldom, but she worked on the basis that if she asked you a question and you couldn't answer it, she would belt it into you. So I got the belt every day. Until one week, I went for a whole week without getting the belt, and I got a chocolate biscuit from my mummy.
It's remarkable that you were a well-behaved kid, but that you still got the belt just through
but we all got the belt, unless you were a teacher's pet. And if you were a teacher's pet, you had a terrible life from the other boys, because they didn't like teachers' pets. By and large, we were all well-behaved boys. We were naughty boys.
What were your favourite subjects at school?
I liked them all in the junior school. I was just interested. And then when we went into the senior school, which is when you started science, you began to get very, very basic science in the junior school. And by that I mean physics, chemistry and biology and things like that. Now that's fascinating. But my favourite subjects, undoubtedly, my favourite one was science. I loved science, because you made smells with science, didn't you? But you also did things. I remember in class 1 or form 1, he brought out this thing that was a bit like a ruler, you see, and it had 2 strips on it. And there were slits riveted together, you see. And he held it on top of the Bunsen burner. And of course it was coefficient of expansion. And then you started getting told about atomic structures, because of course the atomic bomb was quite prominent by that time. And I absolutely loved that. And we had really good science teachers. None of them were to be trifled with. I mean, if a teacher had a curious habit, you would sort of laugh behind his back. Reedy's doing so-and-so, you know. But I loved science. And the more I got to know about it, the more I loved it. And my favourite toys were linked into that, you know, mechano sets, electrical sets. That's why you saw me peering all around this stuff. You know, what am I looking at now? What exactly does deck 4 mean?
Yeah.
So I loved that. I liked maths. And then we went, remember, about Form 2, I think it was, you started with algebra. And then you went on to calculus. And we were all terrified because calculus has an awful reputation. But I found that fascinating, the idea of adding a little bit on and then working out formulae and that sort of thing. And I still find it interesting. The ironic thing is that I went to Watt to study engineering, and it was maths that failed me, which is why eventually I came out and went into the forces to do my 2 years. But I love school.
So that's my next question, really. What was your life journey after you left school then? You went to what?
Up to school, sat leaving certificate. By that time I wanted to be an engineer. Went to what used to be the Heriot-Watt College in Chambers Street, which is opposite the Chambers Street Museum, and it's now the Heriot-Watt University, which is out at wherever it is.
Can I just back a wee bit there? The leaving certificate that you talk about, what did that consist of? So it wasn't like 5 different exams, was it?
Yes, that's the old Scottish leaving certificate that everybody sat at about the age of 16. and that provided you with the necessary certificates to go into university or technical college, like the old Heriot-Watt or the Royal Tech in Glasgow and various other places.
Yeah. So you were always going to leave at 16, were you? Was that the done?
That was the accepted thing. Yeah. One or two boys stayed on to sixth year, and these were the really bright ones, where they were aiming at things like Oxford and Cambridge, as opposed to Scottish universities. So I stayed on to 16 and left then. I'd been accepted for the Heriot-Watt and went there and studied mechanical engineering for what was known as the associateship. The old technical colleges were not universities. They couldn't offer you couldn't graduate and have a degree, but you got the associateship of the college, which was seen by the professional associations like the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, Civil Engineers, what have you, seen as the equivalent of a degree. So at 16, or might have been 17, I went to the Heriot-Watt in Chambers Street and studied engineering there. And that is a fascinating time, because at that time it was the practice, and it might probably still be, that if you're studying something like engineering, you're trying to spend in an engineering company where they taught you the basics. And I spent the first summer holiday in Bruce Peebles, or Parsons Peebles is now, I think. That's down in Leith, heavy electrical manufacturers. And you learnt about the machines. You learnt about mixing with people from all sorts of backgrounds, because if you went to a school like Stewart's or Watson's or Hertz, you're coming from the same social background, unless you went to Fetty's, in which case you're quite separate group. But if you worked on the shop floor being taught, then you were subject to the charge hand, you're subject to the foreman and the works manager and what have you. So you learnt pecking orders, how to behave, and also the way these things were structured. And that was really good. So I was in Bruce Peebles for one summer. Then I thought, I'm going to see if there's anything in aircraft. And I discovered that I wrote to Blackburns, who built the Beverley. I don't know if that name means anything to you. One of these very big heavy transport planes. Wrote to them and said, I'm a student. I would like to, do you have? And in these days, they had training schemes for students, and they would arrange accommodation, and they would give you a nominal pay, but enough to pay for your fags, because we all smoked in these days.
What did you smoke? Can you remember? What brand?
My dad's Players on Piccadilly, if he wasn't looking, and I pinched them. I can't remember what I smoked. Probably Players. And if I was really skint, it would be Willie Woodbines.
But yeah, back to Heriot-Watt.
So I'm back to Heriot-Watt. I've thought a lot about this. I mean, basically, I think the problem was I simply didn't have the ability in maths and the math processes. I'd had difficulty at school, and in fact I had tuition, special tuition, when we were approaching sitting year hires, because we knew that no matter where I wanted to go, whether it was going to be the Heriot-Watt or Royal Tech in Glasgow, I had to have higher maths, and that was always a problem with me. So the Watt didn't work out. Looming over you at all the time when you were at university or college was a thing called deferment. And deferment, when you became, I think it was 16, or maybe it was a year or two later, it doesn't matter, you were eligible to be called up to do your national service, which is 2 years in the forces. But if you were doing a recognised training course, gone to uni or college or what have you, or for that matter doing an apprenticeship as a bricklayer, if it was a recognised course, you could get deferment for the duration of that course, provided A, you attended. So there was an attendance sheet for all of these lectures that went round the class, and B, provided you acquired a satisfactory level. If you didn't, then your deferment was lifted and you get called up. And that's what happened to me. I was at the Watt, and eventually I got called in to see the principal. He said, sorry, Melvin, but this won't do. So I was called in to do my 2 years. But I mean, I'd taken engineering very seriously. I mean, a lot of boys used to go to uni and just be, smoking, drinking and womanising, and got thrown out because they were wasting everybody's time. I wasn't wasting time, but I just didn't have what it took. But I had a good time at the Watt. I was in Bruce Peebles, I've told you about. I did a summer vacation with Blackburns that built the Beverley, and then I spent another summer with Armstrong Whitworth in Coventry, where I did fatigue research, because you'd had all the comet crashes at that time. And that was fascinating. And I was actually conducting series of experiments which were part of a programme. And then at that time I had a trip down to Farnborough because the company laid on a bus to take everybody down. And that was great fun, going around all the different aircraft companies and associated companies and seeing the new aircraft. Because in Farnborough in these days, there was at least one brand new aircraft every year. And then I went across when I was 21, there was a big international exhibition in Brussels. Been one in the Victorian days, and it was called the Welcome Expo. And various universities laid on trips, the Students' Association say, like, let's have a trip to Brussels to the big exhibition. Does the word Atonium ring a bell with you? Big sky, and the Skylon. No. Well, you Google it. Anyway, this is in Brussels, and this is a huge international exhibition, and it was really international. I mean, not the sort of thing that you have at Murrayfield. And you had certainly several hundred students from all places, and that was fascinating. And you got taken around trips. And I remember we had one trip to steelworks in Brussels, or outside Brussels, and we were all taken into this great big shed. We were standing there in a wee group. As I say, we'd be sort of 21, 22-year-olds that time. And there's this ding, ding, ding of a train coming. And of course, it was on these, being a big foundry, you had railway tracks all over the place. And down the corner came this small diesel or steam train, and a blast of heat. And here was a big railway wagon with an ingot of steel or iron, half the size of this area that we're sitting in. And wow, the heat of that was incredible. And of course, if the whole of this went red hot, you might sort of be quite impressed.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating. And then, of course, and that was a fascinating experience because, of course, the students from all over the place. And at this time, you had the tremendous conflict between Israel and the Arab states. And because we were all students, various organisations were very keen to advance their image. So we had trips all over the place to see different things and taken around. And that was a brilliant trip. But that's where, if you look up, I can't remember the name of it, doesn't matter. But it was this big international exhibition. But if you Google Atonium and things like that, you'll pull up stuff. It's 1950 something or other. I went on a trip when I was at school to Belgium, and that was very interesting because Britain, I think I maybe said earlier on, Edinburgh was fairly clear of bombing, apart from Rosyth and attempts to knock the Forth Bridge down. Yeah. But it was when we went to Belgium, I saw the results of it, and even more so when I was in the cadets and we went to Germany, to the Ruhr, Essen, Dusseldorf, and so on. And you saw the destruction of 1,000 bomber raids was just, to small boys, it was just unbelievable. And it was good training, War's not funny. It's maybe exciting on the films and playing it being, but it's not funny. And you learned that as a boy. Apart from the fact I was very lucky my dad came back at the end of the war. But the girl who became my wife, her father did. He was and in fact the timing is right because he was the skipper of a minesweeper and was killed at D-Day. And of course that's when it's all being celebrated. Well, not celebrated, but remembered just now.
And how was your national service? How did you find that?
Nabob. But then you see, I had been brought up by a mother who was a loving, kindly, but quite strict because she'd been a nanny. I went to a school where discipline was just accepted practice. You called the teachers, sir, you behaved yourself, you stood up if the head walked into the classroom, that sort of thing. And you weren't late for school, because if you were, you got lines. And then, of course, on top of that, you went into the cadets at school, CCF as we used to call it, and you learnt about basic drill, standing to attention, all that sort of stuff. It was nothing strange to me to go into the real forces, having been brought up in a school with discipline, having been in the cadets at school. And of course we had great fun in the cadets, playing with rifles, Bren guns. We had our own rifle range at school,
You're a good shot.
What a cheeky question. Would you like to see my first class marksman badge, which I used to have down here? I showed that all with great pride. Yeah, we had a rifle range at Stewart's, and they probably still have, and you used to go up there, and it was 2-2s. And then, of course, you used to go out to places like Dreghorn for a special cadet session. And into the RAF, went through the basic training there, had a shop with Bren guns and Sten guns and doing things.
So sorry, is this still your national service, or is this you've left national service and joined the RAF?
No. And this is national service.
Still within your
I was
service,
actually
right.
in the RAF.
Right, as your national your national service,
yeah,
right?
Because you had the choice, and it was very annoying actually, because it turned out, and I'll cut this story short, I'm colour defective. Now that doesn't mean I can't tell the difference. I don't think that's a red thing when it's but if you are colour defective, then you have difficulty with shades. When does pink become red? There's a whole band. And that meant that when I went into the RAF, for national service, and I remember going along to Dean Park House for the interview, and they said, right, what would you like to do? I'd already applied for a flying scholarship, but because I'm a colour defective, I wasn't eligible. Because if you can't tell the difference of colours, you're not going to be allowed to fly a plane. And I said, well, look, I've studied engineering for so-and-so, degree level and all the rest of it. So I'd like to go into something, preferably with aircraft, because having worked in aircraft firms in the summer. And the chappie looked down the thing and said, well, yeah, that's fine, but he said there's a problem, 2 problems. The first problem is that you're only in the forces for 2 years, and take away your training periods, you're down to about 18 months. It takes 5 years at least to train a mechanic for airframe work. So that's the first problem. But there's an even more serious problem. You're colour defective, so you can't be allowed to do anything that involves colouring. Yeah. So that rules out all electrical work, all electronic work, because they're all colour-coded,
That's heartbreaking.
Black, red and green. If you can't. So they thought about it, but I'd spent a lot of time working during the holidays in my father's office as a glorified office boy and run about and what have you. So they said, we're going to make you a clerk. So I was made what they called a progress clerk. And I've been trying to remember where I was sent to for my training, and I can't remember. And it doesn't matter. But anyway, I went there and did the training to be ending up as a reasonably competent office boy. Because if you're in the forces, you just basically, you do what you're told. Yeah. Simple as that. So as a progress clerk, passed out, because they still had their parades and all the rest of it, and sent to my first station, which was a place called Neatyshed, there was a chain of radar stations right down the east coast, because we weren't very friendly with Mr. Stalin and people like that, and this was underground. I took one look at this display of radar aerials, fascinating. So I went down the stairs, and this was Neatyshed was the name of the station. Coltishall was the station where I stayed. One doesn't stay, one is billeted. And went down, and that was really good. Because of my sort of general upbringing, my general education, having worked in Dad's office and learnt all about files and filing systems and delivering stuff and this, that and the other, I had no bother at all coping with that. And I thoroughly enjoyed myself. And at that time, at least, because of the nature of the work, and you're all underground and what have you, there was a level of informality. Certainly, when you first went in, and there was God, it's a warrant officer. And they would say, all right, come in, sit down. But once he got to know you and had decided, are you quite a nice chap? Are you reasonably well-mannered, courteous and all the rest of it? The whole formality would begin to go. Not totally, of course. The boss is always a boss. Doesn't matter where you're working. But I got to know, and Mr. Harrison was my father's age. Rows of ribbons up. And the other ones. There was one flight sergeant. He was all right, but you had to be careful. If he was not pleased with you, or you did something or whatever, you knew about it. But I was never in trouble. Some of the guys, of course, were just stupid. But you get that in all walks of life.
So how did the rest of your working life unfold?
Right, came up the forces, and I had to make up my mind what to do. And by that time, the Heriot-Watt had introduced a thing called the Department of Industrial Administration, where they taught you basic company law, factories acts, health and safety at work acts, and this sort of stuff, which you had to have if you were going to go into engineering, hopefully up the ladder. So I had that. I also had the experience of working in my dad's office. My dad was a lawyer, so I knew about court systems, not at a very senior level, I don't mean senior, but not at a high level. But I'd done the job of an office boy in a lawyer's office, and running up the courts, and I knew what the judges looked like, and I knew to stand aside, this sort of thing. As you do in any walk of life, you know who the bosses are and who the and all this. And I didn't know what to do. And I'd had the opportunity, for reasons that we won't go into, of going into a firm in Edinburgh as a sort of management trainee. But I began to think, this is not really what I want. And I developed quite an interest in the legal side of engineering and all the rest of it. And something said, why don't you think about law? Because Dad had never, ever put any kind of pressure on me, because he'd started up his own business. You'd think that he might say, well, you're going to follow me on, aren't you? And anyway, to cut a long story short, I thought, yes, I'm going to find out about this. So I got in touch with the Law Society to find out how you entered law. And my problem was that although I had an entrance to Heriot-Watt, I didn't have a university entrance. I didn't have a lower language, and I didn't have Latin, which was essential if you were going to be a lawyer, because there's quite a lot of Latin, and not in law itself, but lots of Latin expressions. And I got the leaflet about the ways you could enter the legal profession and read through that, and there were various different ways. And I remember sitting thinking, yeah, I think so. And I was working in my dad's office on a Saturday morning doing filing, putting files away and whatnot. And he came to the room where I was working on my own, and just sort of said, what are you doing and how are you getting on, and are you getting through the pile of stuff here? And he was giving me a funny look, and I went into my pocket and pulled out this leaflet from the Law Society, but I said, I think you better look at that. He looked at it and then he smiled. He said, I thought there was something up. And that was it. Decision taken, I was going to go into law and become a solicitor. And that involved...
What age are you at this point, sorry, roughly?
I'd be in my early 20s, because I had 3 years at the Watt. 2 years in the forces, having left school at 15, 16. And in these days, if you were going to go into law, you normally did a 5-year apprenticeship, which would, in many cases, consist of 3 years at university, and then 2 years post-graduating to learn the nuts and bolts of actually practicing law. Or you could do a 5-year apprenticeship, where instead of you went to university lectures, and you sat their term exams, but you didn't graduate unless you had matriculated in the first place. But you sat the exams of the Law Society, which was all set by professors of different parts of law. So that's what I did for 5 years as an apprentice, working in an office during the day, going to lectures either during the day or in the evening, depending on what the university timetable was. Sitting the Law Society exams, which I passed, and then got my little certificate and got the title of solicitor.
What was your first job after qualification? Well,
my first job was just as a qualified assistant in my father's firm. And I just did all the sort of work that solicitors do. Well, I'm going to say do nowadays, because it's years since I did anything. But, buying and selling wimpy houses. Well, seeing clients, learning how to deal with clients, make them feel at ease, get out of them what they really should be telling you, not what they do tell you. Yeah. Which is not the same. And getting to know the other firms and the other partners and advocates and so on. And that was a good time. And I was there with my dad for years. And he began to deteriorate and he had an ulcer and all the rest of it. And I was beginning to get a little bit bored with the work I was doing. But one of the things that people in private, the smallest firms do, is to have companies as clients, local companies. And I got involved with British Gas, and I was approached by what they call the regional solicitor in Scotland about problems. They were having trade union problems, and I got approached by him and did a lot of work with them. And I rather liked that. And at the end of it all, I'd sorted out, and part and parcel of doing that work was I met the chairman and the deputy chairman and various other directors and senior people. And anyway, Andrew came to me when we virtually finished all the work. It was because it went on for 2-3 years. And he said, look, I've got a space, because he knew that I wasn't happy in private practice. I got fed up with buying and selling wimpy houses and divorces and he said, I've got a vacancy. I need somebody who's got the sort of background that you've got. And explained as an assistant solicitor. He already had 3 working under him. So I thought about that. And I spoke to Jenny and I said, and I knew what the salary ranges were. And I reckoned that we could carry on living at the standard that we'd been living on the salary at Scottish Gas. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I went through the interview process, which was conducted by the chairman and the deputy chairman, and was asked the usual sort of question, well, why do you want to leave a partnership? And you got to think about how you answer that and Anyway, I was accepted and taken in as an assistant solicitor. That was down at Granton, the old Granton headquarters of Scottish Gas, and did all sorts of things down, whatever was thrown at me. And that was really good. I enjoyed that work. It was really interesting working for them.
And are you a family man at this point? Have you met your wife at this point?
Yes. Oh yes.
How did that happen? How did you get together?
My hobby was, it isn't now really, it was sailing. I had a little boat at Cramond, you see, a little moor dinghy, which you bought as a kit and made yourself. And I did a lot of sailing down at Cramond and ended up on the committee. And the secretary of the committee, the committee used to meet down in the clubhouse every month or whatever. And the secretary of the club I knew very well because he was the head of Greens at Legal Publishing. And so there was a certain common interest. And he had been in what they call the officers' nursing home. It was one of the private little hospitals in Edinburgh for something or other. And he was saying how he'd been there, you see, and he'd been in his bed, and this little nurse had come in, and he'd had a photograph of his own boat on his bedside table, and she'd said, "Oh, that's a nice boat, blah, 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 blah. I went on a wee sailing course once to learn dinghies. Oh, well, you must come down to the club, because you might like it, because we've got lots of dinghies down there." So he said, "Oh, I'm going to..." So there was a hoot of laughter around the table. "Hey, Mel, it's another nurse for you." Because all my girlfriends had been nurses, because they make super girlfriends. So anyway, I went down to the club one day, went into the bar, and there sitting in the corner was this young lassie who was probably about ages with me. And George said, "Come on across." So he said, "Jenny, this is Melvin," because I was called Melvin in these days. And that was it. And 50 years later, so Jenny and I, we just did what young couples do, and went sailing and went all over the place.
So that would be the first date out on the boat, would it be? Or?
No, the first date was in the bar. That continued for years. But yeah, she was a nurse. She was a midwife, and she was in the Simpson at that time. And then she went down as a staff nurse to the Western, and that's where she remained. She was one of the sister midwives down there. And then they developed. I'm now advancing years. You may remember that there was a huge reorganisation of the hospitals in Edinburgh, and things like the Royal began to close down in the Western and the Northern, Southern, and they developed Little France, which is where the Royal now is. It's a huge place.
Was your wife still working when they moved to the Little France then, or was she?
No. At the same time that Little France, there was a big debate going on about what was to happen to the maternity unit at the Western. And I remember going out, one of the big worries, I mean, the Western itself was an excellent hospital, but it was having to deal with a very mixed area. Pilton, Drylaw at one end of the scale, and Barnton.
Yeah, Stockbridge,
and posh areas and all the rest of it.
Mm.
And of course, maternity, I don't know if you're a father or not, but if you are, you'll know that, all sorts of things can go wrong during the initial stages of pregnancy. And there was a lot of disquiet amongst particularly the senior people like Jenny about the ability to provide a good service to places like Pilton and Drylaw from Little France, which is 40 minutes away. And I remember there was going to be a meeting because, nurses don't hold their tongues. If they're not happy about something, they say so. And of course, that's essential in the job. And there was going to be a meeting of senior admin types, and particularly within the health service that were involved in the reorganisation. That this was going to be a meeting of people like that who were organising the reorganisation, all senior staff, both the nursing types like Jenny, and also the actual doctors themselves. And I went along to that meeting, which was chaired by a chap called John Scrimmager, who was the senior consultant in the whole reproductive business of maternity and fertility and all the rest of it, at the Western. And we had some of the senior civil servants along, and they said this, that and the next thing. And it was question time. And I remember, God knows what it was, I got to my feet and I said, "Look, in my previous days in private practice, I used to have a lot of clients who were down in the poorer areas, like Drylaw, Pilton, and further along either side, where the range of poverty and malnutrition and drinking and drugs and all the rest of it is really quite serious, and where there was a need to get emergency services to the people because, of course, if you drink a lot or you don't eat sensibly, your health suffers. And I said, I'm concerned at them coming all the way from Little France, which is way out past Trinent. Anyway, I got the usual sort of political, quite all that. Anyway, at the end of the meeting, Jenny came across and says, look, I've just been speaking to Mr. Scrimmager. Can we give him a lift to his house because he's not getting his car with him? So I met Scrim and we were chattering away generally. And he gave me a wee look. He said, you are absolutely right. We're up to high do about that too. And we can't get it over to these bloody civil servants. so I thought,
just couldn't officially talk about it.
Well, that's right, you see, because he was very senior within his profession.
Yeah.
And the hierarchy of the hospital. But he's got the he mustn't hold things back, otherwise he's not doing his job. But he's got to be careful the way he does it.
Yeah.
If some young whippersnapper stands up and says exactly what he would like to say, it's about him.
Yeah.
So, and poor old John, I never really, I call him John. I didn't call him John. He's Mr. Scrimmager. Died just a matter of a few years after Jenny.
Do you and Jenny have children?
Yep, we had two. Murray and Lindsay, they're in their 50s now. Lindsay's 52 and Murray's, 57.
Is that hard to believe that you've got kids who are in their 50s?
Oh, yeah. Lindsay's a granny. I'm a great-grandpa.
Do you see your great-grandchildren much?
Yes, fairly regularly, not quite as much as I'd like. Mainly Lindsay's. You'll know this, I think, but if you don't, you should know. I've got dementia. I've also got type 2 diabetes. I'm fine just now. It's probably appear pretty normal apart from talking too much. But, and I know that because I had to deal with old people. My mother-in-law was the mason of an old folks home. So, and Jenny and I used to go down there both as a courting couple and then as a married couple with grandchildren to see Granny. So I keep a close eye on myself, looking for changes, and I can see changes, and I know perfectly well that there will come a time when I can't live on my own, and the question is what time. I said to both my kids now, you do not put me in your spare room, you shove me in a home somewhere. Question, where can you find homes to put old people in? There are very few of them now, unless you're prepared to pay, which is an absolute bloody disgrace.
Yeah, it's an outrageous amount of money as well.
Oh, I mean, Jenny's mum ran Dunwhinnie Lodge and Peebles, and it simply took people from the local authority area. They went through some kind of selection process as to what kind of care they needed. And I had to deal with old folk. And the trouble with old folk, and you'll come across this as you see people, they don't take care of themselves, and it's a gradual reduction. I mean, apart from your place, Lindsay came in one Dad, and it was streaks of custard down this. You see, this died straight out of the washing machine because I dribbled. And other things like cleanliness, hygiene. If you have old people coming in, you'll find some of them smell because they don't bath themselves properly. And I mean, that's all part of it. So you need to have homes that people like that can go into. They're still reasonably lively and reasonably intelligent and reasonably silly and all the rest of it. But one day they will go much further down the scale, and they're not doing anything about it. And I mean, there's a number of the homes around Trinity where I am have closed, or they're into sort of flatlets, at X £100 a week or whatever, and you're living on your state pension. Who's kidding who? It's awful. So I shall be interested to see the outcome of the election and what brilliant plans these blankety blank politicians have got.
To return to your life, Mel, did you retire at 65 then?
I can't quite. Well, yes, give or take 5 or 10 years.
And what's filled your retirement? What have you done?
All sorts of things. I carried on with my old interests. For a while I carried on sailing. Jenny and I carried on going abroad and things like that. Jenny used to go into Palestine. Pardon me. She and her cousin were very much involved with Arabs and the problems, and they used to disappear to Palestine every year for 2 or 3 years. So that kind of thing carried on. My interest in things like geology carried on. I used to go to the talks with the Edinburgh Geological Society and things like that. I carried on going to the RNSO, that's Usher Hall. I carried on, Jenny and I used to go there, we went there every Friday, almost every Friday night throughout the whole of our marriage, because we were both interested in the so-called classics. So I carried on. And then Jenny began to go down. I began to develop things, pacemakers and that sort of thing. But Jenny began to go down, and I knew there was something going on. And to cut the long story short, it turned out she had cancer. At the same time, I'd noticed a change in myself, which resulted in me, well, not until afterwards. But I began to think, for example, one very good example, when they brought it out in the purple-tinged headlight bulbs. Do you remember that? They changed from the ordinary yellow bulbs, and they started having coloured tinges. A bit like your brake light and your indicator bulbs. But this was the headlight. And I detested them. Anyway, Jenny took ill, and, cancer just took its place, and she just quietly deteriorated. And I looked after her. We had super neighbours. The next door neighbour was a doctor. And I remember by this time Jenny was bedridden, and I went in just to see how she was, to give her her pills and things like that. And she was obviously delirious. So I went through and saw, God, her name's suddenly gone, doesn't matter. She was a professor of pathology at the university, and much about the same age. And I went through Jan Bell. I said, Jan, something far wrong with Jenny. Could you come through and just have a look-see? So she came through, took one look at her, sat at the edge of the bed and asked her a few questions, trying to get sensible answers. Anyway, it turned out that this was the cancer had really bitten. And the next thing, Jan said, look, hospice time. And the local GP who was looking after Jenny had already done whatever they do to trigger off, warning the hospices that, right, you've got somebody who's going to be coming to you probably in the next 6 weeks, 6 months or whatever. And the next thing was, packed a bag, ambulance came and took Jenny and me along to the hospice. That's one just along the road from me, at Starbank. And it was, what was his name again? Cheshire. Leonard Cheshire, the bomber pilot. He was one of the Cheshire homes, and she went into there, and I which was literally 5 minutes along the road from me. And I used to go along and see her, obviously every day. I mean, she would just skip this little bit. Okay. She died, and that was it. And then, of course, you go through all the rigmarole of phoning people. How the hell do I tell the kids? How do I... Lindsay had already lost her husband, who was killed in a motorcycle accident just 4 years ago, with, at that time, 2 kids who'd been the same age as Jenny when she'd lost her dad at D-Day. So that, of course, gives you an inner strength. And you can just sort of get on with it. And Lindsay was brilliant. She just girded her loins when Al died. Anyway, we went through all the palaver of when somebody dies in your family. And that's very difficult. One of the things that I found extremely difficult, it's funny, the tears didn't come much at all, but by God, they come now. Yeah. And the other big change is that Lindsay had me out. Oh yes, that's right. It was then that I began to go down a bit, and I woke up one morning with a horrendous pain in my leg, the right leg. And I thought, what's that? And rubbed it, is it a cramp or whatever? And eventually I phoned up Lindsay and I said, look, I've got this dreadful pain in my leg and I don't know what to do. And Lindsay, being Lindsay, just girded her loins and said, right, I'll sort this out. The next thing I knew was the ambulance arrived, and they came in. And it turned out I had torn my soleus muscle. And I said, when they told me that, I said, how can you tear us? That's one of the strongest muscles in your leg.
Yeah.
How can I tear that lying in bed? Well, that's what it was. So I stayed with Lindsay. She had a spare room, and I was kept there. And of course, because I'd already had the pacemakers and the heart-related problems, I had the district nurse visiting me every day or thereabouts until they satisfied themselves that the soleus muscle problem was not a heart problem. So I stayed with Lindsay for a number of days, and that's when I was taken out. The old Royal used to have some kind of out department, where they did things like assessing, for example, aging-related problems. And they assessed me and asked me all sorts of daft questions, What's the Queen's name? And this, that, and the next thing. And I remember very distinctly the consultant or the doctor that I was with drew a geometric diagram, maybe say a rectangle, A, B, C, D. Right, with your finger, just join A to C. I couldn't do it. I said, this is ridiculous. I studied engineering at degree level for 3 years and I can't draw a line from A to C. And they said, sorry, look, calm yourself. Who's the comedian who used to say that? Calm. Anyway, and the outcome of all of that, they did various other things. And that was when they diagnosed dementia. Fairly mild, but something that will in due course progress. And then we had to think, right, okay, what are they going to do with the old boy? And I stayed with Lindsay until they had got the leg under control and had really got things sorted out. And I said to Lindsay, I want to stay at home as long as somebody's. And the great thing, you're probably aware of this, if you're not, you should be. The facilities that are available for ageing people in the Lothians is tremendous. And if you are diagnosed with one of the dementias, whether it's Alzheimer's or what have you, it doesn't matter, you put on a sort of a register with the local authority and the health authority, and you're then sent a load of bump saying you can go to the Old Folks Museum for an interview and this, all sorts of things. And I go to 2 classes. One is a balance and fitness, which is at Ainsley Park, and the other one is, and that's where you do exercises, because the type 2 diabetes affects your balance, because it also affects the blood supply to you. You see, I've got all sorts of stones and things on my shoes just now. Well, I haven't, of course, but it's what my feet think I have.
Well, that's good to hear. There's a lot of negative stuff said about the NHS and councils and authorities, but to hear that there's that kind of support when you do get diagnosed with dementia.
It's grossly overstated in certain respects. I am very pleased with them. I've had a new pacemaker installed, for example, and I've had various other things. But waiting lists are really silly. The other thing that I had the other day there, I'm still National Health. I'm a great believer in the National Health. I'm left of centre, but I'm not. I'm not a Scargo type. Anyway, I had problems with some of the lower molars there, you see. And I went to dentist too. And he was having trouble extracting it, because the problem with teeth is the old teeth fall to bits if you're trying to extract them, and you end up with part of the roots being left in the jaw. And he said, I'm going to have to give you more serious local anaesthetic and all this to sort with this. I can't do this right away because it needs far too much preparation. It's not like just going having a wee filling.
Yeah.
But they said, my waiting list is so long to get this done. But he said, we can go private if you like, because I've got a private company that can deal with these things as well. And I said, well, that's fine, because of the way things worked out for me, I've got a reasonable amount of cash aside. So it was going to be about a 7-week to get this thing fixed, which had the potential of making life extremely unpleasant until it was fixed. And I said, well, that's okay. So what sort of cost is that going to be? Because that's not nationals. And it was going to be £700. And I said, well, that's okay. That's not a problem. But I said, how do people who are on a pension, a state pension, cope with that? And I just got a look and said, well, that's truth of the matter, they can't. And you've probably seen in the papers now, people extracting their own teeth. And you hear this, I've heard it quite often recently, because the waiting list for dentists is so long, and the private ones are so expensive, but with long waiting lists as well. You can't get it. Anyway. Yeah,
it's a national scandal. My kids don't have an NHS dentist. That's how scandalous it is.
Yeah.
They don't, because there's none available at all in my area.
I think it's absolutely appalling. Because they started the health service when I was a kid, because it was 47, 48. And given the due, a lot of the doctors in particular, although they were in private practice, if they thought, and before the health service started, you still paid. But a lot of the GPs took the attitude, look, if somebody needs help, my duty by Hippocratic oath, and they would do it. And I remember my mum saying that when I had pneumonia and pleurisy, which was a killer in these days, what they would quite often do, you see, oh well, doctor, now I've got 2 shillings here. Is that's absolutely fine, Mrs. Farquharson. I've just been baking scones. Could I give you a few scones? And it was like that. It was very much look after people. I'm blethering. What am I on about?
Not at all. They're all good points. We're going to draw it to a close now, though.
Yep.
And let's finish with something nice and positive. What when you look back, what are you happy at? Where are your happiest memories? When were you happiest?
Oh, with my wife and family, except when the boys were being naughty, or my son was being naughty and getting into trouble. He's now a highly respectable 56-year-old or 57-year-old. But oh no, it's actually quite. No, I'm not going to compare my childhood and my married life, but they are both equally important.
I'll allow you equal first. I'll allow you equal first, Mel. That's all right. Melvin, thank you so much for joining us today on Lifestory and sharing your memories.
Yeah, not at all. It's been my pleasure.
That was Melvin Farquharson on Lifestory. If you've got a memory you'd like to share, please pop in to see us at the Wee Museum of Memory on the 2nd floor of Ocean Terminal in Leith. You can also visit our Facebook page to keep up with our regular events. Or you can view related videos, podcasts, and more on our YouTube channel, either of which you can find by simply searching Living Memory Association. You can also find links, information, and over 3,000 photos hosted in conjunction with Edinburgh Collected on our website at www.livingmemory.org.uk. If you've enjoyed this episode of Lifestory, our other reminiscence and music-related podcasts, such as Leith Lives, Forgotten Songs from the Broom Cupboard, Analog Roy's Jukebox, and more can be found on the Projects tab of our website, or via Apple Music, YouTube, or Spotify. Until next time, thank you for listening.